pause button? Yes.
Oh, is the mute? No, I'm on now.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, welcome everybody, part 3.
Thank you.
Yes, you're welcome. You're welcome. And so I did end up, in the end of the day, really focusing on Teilhard again. You know, just to kind of bring us back through. But I do want to give us a little bit of just a reminder of where we went. So I want to bring us back a little bit to, I wonder if I should do that, or, you know what, never mind. Let's just, you guys will have to just remember. So remember when we talked at the beginning about kind of the way that the early church tried to understand this whole idea of the Word become flesh, right? What does that mean for the infinite to become finite, right? For the divine to become human, for that which was supposed to be changeless and eternal to enter the world of time. How do we get that? How do we understand that? What's going on in Jesus, like in his body, you know, like his actual physical body? What was happening in the womb of Mary? You know, like how did the body change because the divine got in there? You know, remember that was one strategy to say it's a super body somehow, like, or not really a body. We talked a little bit about that. Those are the different, remember there was different strategies. You know, there was this one strategy that said Jesus' body was totally illusory, like it was not real. Now, and somebody asked me, might have been Heidi, like, you know, did they think like that you could just put your hand through it? No, because the idea was that it was so illusory that we would still feel it as a real body, but it wasn't real. Because they were so anxious about what? They were so anxious that how could God, who's supposed to be eternal, be in this changeable form, you know, in this changeable body, a body that decays, that corrupts, you know. So remember there's arguments back and forth, and, you know, some people even said, well, he, you know, Jesus is a superhuman, but not quite God, right? Like he was at one step below God, was still created, but was super above all human beings, like in this other realm of his own. That were the Arians. And then there were people who said, no, there was this one nature. It became one thing. The divine and the human mixed together like it's some kind of like stew or something. But the problem with that was people were like, well, then wouldn't he be different than us? And if he's different than us, then he doesn't share in our humanity. If he doesn't share in our humanity, how does he save us? You know, he becomes like Mary, who's doesn't really share in real womanhood. It seems like in history, you'll get that from my sermon later. But the people who already heard it might get that. So you know, like that. I'll explain that joke. So you know, Mary through the years, she's been depicted as kind of like a super mother. You know, a mother who never got mad, who never like cursed, who never like, you know, and always dressed in this lapis lazuli robes and looking off into heaven. You know, never had, like, there was a sort of loss of her womanhood, her reality. So like, is that what Jesus was? Was he like this non-person that we can never identify with? So you know, this was an argument, and actually like people became factions, and in fact the barbarians who invaded Rome were Christians. Did you know that? The barbarians that invaded Rome were Christians. What kind of Christians? They were Arians. So yeah, so it's kind of interesting. They actually didn't destroy a lot of the Catholic churches in Rome because they were Christian. So there were like, this was real deal stuff. This wasn't just like a couple people in Good Shepherd in the World arguing about something. Not that we really argue in Good Shepherd in the World, but you know. This was like there was real consequences. So anyway, they called a council. The emperor called a council and said, you guys got to figure this out. And so they came up with this vocabulary, and I don't really care if you understand the Greek philosophy. In fact, I barely understand the Greek philosophy. But they came up with this idea that there were two natures and one hypostasis. You remember what hypostasis is? Oh, come on. I can't call on somebody and be like, what's hypostasis? No. So hypostasis is a Greek term, and it means kind of like existence. So don't really think too hard about it, because in some ways it was defined, as we say, implicitly. Meaning, in other words, there's nothing you could really point to outside to say that's what it means. It had its own meaning just because of the way what problem they were trying to solve. And so they said, there is this thing, this hypostasis, and in that hypostasis there are these two natures. What happens to those two natures? Do they mix? Huh? Do the two natures mix? Oh, you guys should all say, no! No, they don't mix. They don't mix. No, that's right. Do the two natures, let me see, what was the other thing? Do the two natures change? No, they don't change. They're still human and still divine.
Father Rick, though, don't they get better because they coexist?
Well, wait a second. Yeah, you're right. I didn't say they didn't influence each other. And I remember when you got to think, you got to go back to the Platonic idea of universals versus individuals too, right? So human nature is a universal. In fact, some modern philosophers would say there's no such thing as human nature. Jacques Lacan would say there's no such thing as a woman. And what he meant was every woman is an individual. There's no woman that everybody is trying to aspire to. Everybody's an individual. I don't know why he said there was no thing as a man. I do kind of know why, but we won't bore you with that. Just so he's talking about the universal. He's still participating in the universal human nature, and the divine is neither universal nor particular because it's divine, so it's infinite. So just don't worry about this. This is not necessary to what we're going to get into. I just want you to remember what they were about. So, does the divine or the human change because they're together? Does either one diminish or does either one increase? No. Now, here's the other current that I was trying to get at with this. So basically, let's just say this. I'm going to finish this part out, and then I'm going to go to the second theme that we need to remember. The finishing it out is simply to say that the terms of the argument had been settled. Okay? No one any longer could be like, oh, it's one nature. Oh, it's, superhuman. Oh, it's illusory. No, they can't say that anymore. The church has decided. Two natures, one hypostasis, they don't change each other. That's it. That's how they got to that's why so the infinite becomes finite. Do we know how? No. Do we know what that means exactly? No. But we can't say the infinite changes and the finite doesn't change either.
So
they're preserved.
So the other philosophies of the mixing and the superhuman have been overruled.
They have been declared anathema. Do they disappear? No, they do not disappear. The Nestorians, who were monophysites, basically, I think, went to India, actually, and they still exist. Yeah, so it's interesting. They don't disappear, but they become anathema. They become no longer Catholic or Orthodox. So that I just want us to get that, because when Teilhard starts talking, you have to realize he's talking within this tradition. And then the other piece, which to me is the more interesting piece, what about the body? Is the body bad? It's not really bad, right, to Christians. Why? Why isn't it bad? Because it's made by God, that's right. And the human being was formed in the image and likeness of God. Well, the form of the human being is bodily, is corporeal, is flesh. So the flesh can't be bad. But what was Augustine's problem?
Desires, right?
Right. So the will was the problem. And he thought, so he still had this kind of hierarchy, the spirit was better than matter. And matter dragged us lower, and the spirit lifted us higher. And the problem with our will was that we had this desire, and we looked for love in all the wrong places. What? That's right, it is. So Augustine carries with him this suspicion of the body. And we carry that with us up to the current day. That is a part of us. This, I told you about sexuality in the Catholic Church still teaches that the primary reason for sexuality is procreation, even within marriage. Like, it's not that you can't not have sex and not procreate, but ultimately that's the reason for it. It's not about love, it's not about pleasure, it's about procreation. Well, what becomes of the body and its desires with that? Basically, it's like it becomes bad. Like, all sexual desire becomes bad. Now, that's not the only desire, right? There's also desire for food, and things like that. And that idea of the desire becomes kind of corrupt, So there's this suspicion, and it's like the closer we get to the spirit, the less our body matters. Okay? And Teilhard has a little of this still, too, but remember, Teilhard really, I wish I was lost in a sea of matter. Remember that? He's still, so I do think incarnation, as the concept has evolved, has lifted up matter more now than it did then. Like, in other words, there is a change. So Teilhard sees matter and spirit as two sides of the same coin. And we'll get back to that as we go back through Teilhard. But I just wanted you to remember that idea, like asceticism. And what's asceticism about? Asceticism, meaning the disciplines we do, like fasting and all that stuff, that's to tame the body. That's the original thought. Like, we're taming the body. We're saying, no, 9 to the, you always have to use German when with that kind of thing. Like, you can't do that, and I don't want to say, and Teilhard would not say that ascetical practices are absolutely wrong. It's just Teilhard wants us to turn the jewel a little bit, to see a different facet and say, maybe asceticism is not about the inherent evil in matter and the body and our desires, but maybe asceticism is about reordering them and transubstantiating matter. Why did I use that term? Why did I say transubstantiating it? Where does it come from? What does that term come? Where does that come from? It's not in the Bible. It's not in the Bible. It's a form of transformation, but where does transubstantiation come from? It comes from the Eucharist, where the bread becomes body, right? So Teilhard would see all of our lives as transubstantiating matter into spirit, but not by then immaterializing the matter, but by reorienting matter towards its truth. It's its omega point, as we talked about before. So there we go. That's my recap. Okay. Anything else that we want to talk about before we have 1 minute, 2 minutes? No. Okay. It might come up again. Okay. Review a little bit. I just a couple quotes in the beginning. This is from God's Grandeur, Gerald Manley Hopkins. And for all this, nature is never spent. There lives the dearest freshness deep down things. That's such a Teilhardian kind of way of thinking like that. Of course, Gerald Manley Hopkins lived before Teilhard, but they were both Jesuits. But he, this idea that there's something in the depths of matter, the depths of nature, that is mysterious and contains the divine fire. You might remember this. For me, my God, all joy and all achievement, the very purpose of my being and all my love of life, all depend on this one basic vision of the union between yourself and the universe. I have no desire, I have no ability to proclaim anything except the innumerable prolongations of your incarnate being in the world of matter. That's a little bit like Teilhard, like he would all of a sudden get into this, like his own little language, like the innumerable prolongations of your incarnate being in the world of matter. I can preach only the mystery of your flesh, you the soul, shining forth through all that surrounds us. He'll sometimes use the phrase diaphany for this shining forth. Diaphany means shining through. So January 6th is what holiday holy day in the church? Epiphany. So it's the same idea. Epiphany means like a shining into or something like that, shining down. Like epiphany is like the burning bush or something like that. Diaphany he's coining that phrase to mean that the divine is actually in you and shining forth from you, shining forth somehow from the cosmic. I don't want to get too conceptual about that. I just want you to see where he's trying to shift us. It's not that the divine is outside to come in. The divine is already here and is shining forth.
Father Rick, I was thinking about this when you talked about this the other week, though, and to me, I don't know if I'm interpreting it correctly or not, but to me it's like when you hike, for hours and you get to the top of a mountain and it's just
this vista.
It's just gorgeous, and you're like, there has to be a God because this is gorgeous.
Yeah.
That's what that is.
Yes, and absolutely. And so that seeing is what he wants to say he's teaching us to do. That kind of seeing. There's got to be a God, because look at all this, this beauty. So anyway, all right. Yeah, I think that was a perfect interpretation. That's him. Remember, I wanted to just do two things on his chronology. We don't have to go back through his chronology. Heidi asked me about why he became a stretcher bearer. And from the only thing I could figure out was that he volunteered to be a stretcher bearer. Now, I don't know what his choices were. But in other words, because the whole point was he was an ordained priest by that time, and so she was wondering if he could have been in a combat role, I think.
Or if he was a conscious objector.
Yeah, or if he was a conscientious objector. He was not a conscientious objector. I know that part. But I think he chose stretcher bearer. You know why? Because he knew he'd be on the front lines for that. He didn't want to be like a chaplain in the back or something. And now the second thing I want you guys to, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, synanthropos. And I will tell you a little bit about human evolution in a second, just because I think it's an interesting context. Remember, he was part of the group that discovered that, and I figured out what his role was there. So remember, he's a geologist. He's a geologist. So what he was doing was dating. They found this skull in a cave, and he was using this geology knowledge to date where that was his role in that discovery. They no longer call it synanthropos. They're considered part of Homo erectus now, for any science buffs out there. I'm sure that everybody was burning about that, being like, I've never heard of synanthropus. There must be some other thing. So anyway, remember his early love of iron, right? And I didn't say this part of his story, but when he would go as a young boy, he would actually take these little iron things that he found, and he would put them in a little safe place somewhere. I assume it was like a little thing under a bush or in a little, and he would go there, and he called himself my little pagan soul, he said, because these were my idols, And remember, he said, I just had this feeling I wanted permanence. I wanted something that would last through time. And then what happens?
It rusted.
Yeah, where is it? Sorry. It rusted, exactly. And he became so devastated. He had another experience I didn't tell you about. He had curly hair, and mom was cutting his hair one day, and his hair fell into the fire. And his hair, she gave it to him, actually. I think what happened was she gave it to him, and he threw it in the fire. And then he saw his hair burn up. And he was like, he had a panic attack, basically, sounds like, and was like, oh my God, this is me. I'm like, I'm going to, one day I will die too. This is very interesting. I sort of contrast Teilhard with these early thinkers, but remember, what was their anxiety? The divine shouldn't be able to be corrupted. It shouldn't decay. And where does he start? He starts his spiritual autobiography, remember his story of his spiritual journey, as fear of decay. He wanted to find something permanent. But he does it without saying it's this otherworldly realm. He finds it in spirit, but he defines spirit as a kind of principle that's pulling matter towards its end. We'll get it. We'll try to get that again in a second. Remember this. I would never feel at home except in an ocean of matter. I love that line. Remember quartz? He still, after the iron thing, he thought, well, maybe it's in rock. in the courts that are around around there, and the Chalcedony, or whatever, however you say that. I still haven't figured out how to say that. It's Chalcedony. It's the name of a gem that's found in that area. Also in Morocco. Remember his volcanic area where he lived? Those are French volcanoes. So let's talk about evolution a little bit. So when he is studying philosophy, I think, his philosophy years. So the Jesuit training goes, you do like 4 years of philosophy, plus you do regular academic, like college. Then you go teach, actually. And he taught physics and chemistry in Cairo. And then you come back and do theology. And remember I told you that during that time, France had kicked out the religious orders, supposedly, meaning they couldn't have their institutions in France. So where was he? He went to England. When he was in England, he began to read, he read Henri Bergson's book called Creative Evolution. And he learned about Darwinian evolution. And it blew his mind. It blew his mind because remember, the worldview of the church, even because it's based upon Aristotle and Aquinas, had a real hard time understanding process, right? The world was created. God created. What does God create? Like, if we create something, does it change other than decay? I mean, like, but does it become something does it become something other than what we created it to be? You know, I mean, I know you could probably argue a little bit, yes, but if I create a chair, if I build a chair, it stays a chair, right? Unless I use it as a footstool or something. But I mean, it like, that's it, it's done, Well, there was this whole concept that species were eternal. Remember the Platonic thing? Remember, species is a universal. Human nature is a universal. It doesn't change. Well, then Darwin comes along and he says, no. There are new species, and species die. Whoa, the church had a hard time with that, and not as much anymore, but then. And so a lot of philosophy and stuff is not very process-oriented. There's a lot about, even philosophers still look for these universals and look for these kind of static kind of things. So all of a sudden, Teilhard has this thing like, wow, the universe is not static, it's dynamic, but he also says, hey, there's a principle in matter. There's a principle embedded in matter, the principle of evolution. Okay? Does that make sense? Matter changes, but it doesn't just die. It can become something new. That, for him, is where he begins to see creation and the cosmos is not finished. And he begins to call it cosmogenesis. I don't know if he uses that term quite that early, but that's where he begins to get this idea. Remember, that was he would have some of his thoughts as he said, I was walking in the Sussex forests and at sunset. So that's the Sussex forest at sunset. So we're going to talk about the noosphere a little bit, and I talked about that burning away of his hair a little bit last time, but I remember the World War I experiences, and he begins to get this idea of humanity. So let's go back to this idea of evolution and the human phenomena, right? So he writes this book called The Phenomena of Man, is how it used to be translated, but it really actually is better translated, the human phenomena. That's not just a politically correct thing. It is really in French, it's Le Phénomène Humain, or something like that, and which is basically the human phenomena. So why is that title important? The title is important because Teilhard thinks he's doing science in this book, not philosophy and not theology. He thinks he's doing science. Why do you think he would be thinking he's doing science? Like, I know you guys haven't read it, but you've heard me talk a little bit about Teilhard. Why did he think he was doing science? Anybody have a speculation?
talking
Well,
about.
he taught chemistry and physics.
Sure, right. So he does use some of that knowledge in this book. And remember, he's a paleontologist by this point. So, but why would this book, which talks about this thing called an omega point, which talks about how evolution has a purpose, which talks about, like, you know, everything's moving in this direction toward the evolution of consciousness, why would he call it science? Doesn't that sound like philosophy? I mean, to me it does.
Matter changing.
So I think you're on the right track there. So he is saying that, listen, I'm observing what has happened through the eons. I'm observing that, and these are the conclusions I'm making. These are the theories I'm hypothesizing about what's happening in history.
Well, he's collecting data.
He's collecting data. And this book is filled with that. He'll talk about Sinanthropus, and how around Sinanthropus there were found artifacts, and he says they probably had fire. Ooh, this is the beginnings of consciousness. He thought fire was a really major, well, it was a major leap in human evolution, because, and you guys probably know this, some of you may, fire was an amazing leap because you cannot eat enough calories raw to keep you going. Like, you would be spending most of your time gathering and stuff like that if everything you ate was raw. Cooking concentrates calories. So cooking allowed the human being to have more leisure time, basically. And so there was a thought that fire allowed for the evolution of consciousness, or greater consciousness. So, Teilhard thinks, he's saying, look, remember, he's a geologist. He's like, let's take the big view and say, hey, we start with this cosmic Big Bang or whatever. I don't know, I can't remember if he doesn't really go back that far, but let's just, he talks about the origins of the universe and elements and chemicals, and he may go back this far, I can't remember. But anyway, then planets begin to form. And then rock layers pile on top of each other, and volcanic activity happens. And within the volcanic activity, you begin to have the emergence of life. So he calls that biogenesis. Remember, this is all within the context of cosmogenesis. This cosmos and he says, I mean, that's kind of interesting, right? That all this stuff would come together to form life, And he'll say, and Larry said this yesterday, or last time, and I think it was a good point, and he'll say this very thing. It could be random. It could be just randomness. Life just emerged randomly because of the random processes of evolution. In fact, science, that's like, so, just to give you briefly what evolution is scientifically. So evolution is the random introduction of changes in genetic material or chemical material that allows for recombinations, that allows for new entities that may fit better into their environment and go on to reproduce. Okay? So it's, you can see what's the fundamental driver of that evolution according to that view. What drives evolution according to that view?
Survival.
Fitness and randomness. Right. So it's all contingency. Even fitness is contingency. Like, in other words, nobody like intentionally created an environment and then put in something to evolve into that environment. The environment is random or contingent, let's say that. And the evolutionary process is random. That's the dominant view. But Teilhard says, well, we've got a choice, right? Why do we have to think that way? I mean, isn't this weird that this whole process leads to these beings that can reflect. And so this is the evolutionary tree. Humans are right here. It's kind of a weird graph, so just to give you a little orientation, this is the birth of the Earth. And so it's spherical almost, it's like coming out this way, and so so each year thing is, how do you do this? Yeah, so each of these little things is the same, is contemporaneous, right? So this is like today. So that whole thing is contemporaneous. So this is the evolution of life. Now, and he looked at something like this and was like, wow, like diaphany. He thought, God is speaking through that to me. And so this is the evolution of humans, the way I think it's fairly contemporary. You start back with the common ancestor and you kind of come down. Each of those red things, you notice the red things come in a break, like it's this way or this way. And they just are different sort of events in the evolution of humans. Remember I told you, so he was involved in Synanthropus, which is Homo erectus. Okay, and then Homo sapiens. So okay, big deal, right? Humans. Who cares? Like, why does that make you think of God? We kind of kill each other, and we can be jerks, and what's so special? That's and I say that because that's the philosophically for centuries. That's how humans were considered special. But Darwin said, we're just part of this process. We're just part of that other process, which I can't go backwards, but I don't think I can go backwards. No. Can I? No. Yeah, I can't go backwards. We're just part of this process. Because look, what's the other emotion that you could have when you look at this? We said awe, okay, is one. You could also just be overwhelmed and be like, look at all these little branches. You don't even know where we are, right? I had to point it out. Like, we're here.
And we're the littlest part.
Yeah. It's like we're this little branch over here.
It's like looking at the stars.
Right. That's the other thing. Camus, not Camus, was it Camus? He talked about his book where the guy's in the prison and he looks out through some hole in the ceiling and he sees the massive stars and he says, I don't know if it was Camus, because Camus had a little bit more theology in him, but they basically said, it's like all meaningless. That was the response to this. It's like, we're just one of some little dot on this little thing that's just sort of hurtling through the universe, and that's all we are, So that's a 20th century thing. Teilhard was French. The French existentialists were some of this, where there is no ground to our lives. So remember, he's a geologist. So he began to think of the evolution of humanity in terms of these kind of spheres. So have you guys heard of this new term called the Anthropocene? No? Okay. So you've heard of terms like the Pleistocene and the, I don't know all those things, but you guys have heard of those things, right? No?
Yeah.
No? Okay. So there are, anthropologists and geologists divide history into ages, okay? Remember, you've heard of things called like the Stone Age and the Iron Age and all that stuff. Though they have scientific terms too, like Pleistocene and blah, blah, blah and all. So the newest, there's this theory that we actually now live in the Anthropocene. How do we tell when one age, how do they date things geologically? Do you know? How do you look at layers and decide where they're from? How do you know that one layer's not like got accidentally shifted below another layer? How do you know that layer's deeper? Do you know? Anybody?
Tectonics.
Huh?
Shifting.
Tectonics is, well, so tectonic theory came after the idea of dating geologically. So what I'm asking is, how would you know what, like, when one layer is older than another or less old than another? Huh? You could do carbon dating, but that's using before carbon dating. How did you?
What was in it?
Yes, what was in it. So things like if there's fossilized animal life, you know you're farther up in the history. So the Anthropocene, what are we going to find in the layers of humanity? Human bones, maybe. What else? Human detritus. Trash. iPhones. You know, we cover the earth in that. So think of it. So he had this idea of these layers forming, right? And remember the last layer he talks about is called, where are we going? There we go. Remember, it's called the noosphere. Okay, remember you got the geosphere, you got the biosphere, you got the atmosphere, and then you got this thing called the noosphere. So, and I think I kind of used an analogy last week about the internet. Like some people like you could Google like noosphere and the internet, and somebody will come up with some like, yes, the internet is Taylor thought about the internet or something. But he really did think, and remember this goes back to his World War I experiences. Remember where he said, hey, you know, like it's kind of weird. Humans form, when they get together and they have common experiences, they create a kind of superhuman environment, a milieu. You know, remember I talked about like World War I, like everybody had common experiences, and so their experience, their environment was influencing them, and as they talked, their speech, like as they communicated with each other, it was also influenced by the environment they were in, okay? So I gave you that example of, like, does Good Shepherd have a milieu? Yeah, you know, like you go in here, it's not the same feeling as you go to Ascension. We probably don't talk about the same stuff even. You might think you don't want to talk about the same stuff over there or something. You know, like, I'm sort of joking, but like so two families, right? Like what I talk about at Marge's family's house and what I talk about at my upstate house are different. It's different. The environment forms our speech. And so he thought that, he said, maybe that's happening globally. This is back, remember, this is in the 50s, okay? And he's thinking, could this happen globally? And in fact, he thinks that ultimately evolution is converging. Okay, so go back to that picture of the branching out, right? He draws this picture of just the human branches, and then he takes all those human branches and goes whoop, into this thing called the omega point. Which I looked at that picture and I thought, that's not what I would get from everything below that. Like, you know, it's all going this way in a splay, you know, but he's saying, what he sees in his vision is he thinks we're moving closer together. You know, and you kind of heard that. I mean, look at the coronavirus thing. I mean, we're pretty close together. I mean, that coronavirus went from South Africa to LA in a matter of, God knows, way before we even knew there was such thing as Omicron, you know? So like, how connected we all are. Like, you know, he saw that happening. He thought he saw the evolution of consciousness as the purpose of evolution. He said, the human being and consciousness is evolution being able to reflect on itself. And he thought the ability to reflect on yourself was transformative. Like absolutely a new thing. Okay, so you guys are, you know, so you're probably thinking, that's interesting. But like, what is weird about that? What was mind-blowing to him about that? If consciousness is part of evolution, if the evolution of consciousness is part of evolution, what does that say about matter? What do you think he would think it says about matter?
It's okay.
It changes.
The pinnacle.
Yeah, like is consciousness material? Can I touch consciousness? You could tell me that there are correlates in the neural network that create consciousness, but consciousness, can you see the words I'm saying? Can you see the concept? Can you touch them? So, if the evolutionary process, which starts with rocks and chemicals, can now become consciousness, then isn't matter and spirit the same? Aren't they're part and parcel of the same thing? Matter was created for the purpose of consciousness. That's his vision. Do you get it or no? Or yeah, go ahead.
Is consciousness then moving to the divine?
Okay, wait, we're not there. You remember we did talk about this a little bit last week. So yes, that's the short answer is yes. But we're not quick.
Does that not also mean that other forms of matter, non-human forms of matter are evolving toward consciousness?
Yeah. And listen, he's not the only philosopher to think this. There are philosophers who would say that there is forms of consciousness even in the beginnings. But the way you define consciousness, but it's okay, because remember where they're going with this. All consciousness is not just about thinking beautiful thoughts. Consciousness is the ability to sort of interact with the environment. So does bacteria have consciousness? In that definition, right? Because it senses the gradient of glucose and will move up the gradient of glucose. Okay, that's what the bacterial. That's how it senses it. It has receptors on its cell wall which can tell it how much glucose is here, and it looks around and it figures, oh, this is where. Let me go to the source. And ants have a similar kind of way that's how they don't. There's no ant super brain that's like the queen isn't going, I want you all to line up and I want you to go straight over there. Each ant has a limited, it has sort of rules that it follows. And other ants will then, one of the rules is if this dude's going that way, you go that way too. And so, I'm not really an ant guy, so I don't really know this. So don't push me. But I'm just saying, there's this, organisms have these organizing tendencies.
But there's a difference between that and reflecting on morality.
Correct.
Okay.
And he thinks the same thing too. But he thinks that it's all moving in that same direction, and that you can see early forms of it. I think I've told you guys before about that book called The Evolution of Beauty. Okay, remember? Okay. So this is a book that it's theoretical partly, but it's really about birds. Why do birds have beautiful foliage? Or whatever, not foliage, whatever that's called. Plumage, thank you. Yeah, sorry. Why do birds have beautiful plumage?
So I can appreciate them.
And to attract.
Ha! That's right. That's the Teilhardian answer.
That's anthropomorphic, though.
It is.
Yeah.
A little, but it's also the Teilhardian answer. But it is a little anthropomorphic. And I'll tell you why I think it's Teilhardian. But why did it evolve that way?
To attract the other.
To attract
Maybe.
males or females?
Females.
Females, interestingly enough, right?
Yeah.
So the males are the ones getting all excited, and there's that bird that dances.
Yes.
Yeah, Isn't it weird? Why is it this? I just think this is really a rhetorical question, sort of. But why do birds and us think the same things are beautiful? Right? We have similar tastes. We have the same tastes as peacocks. I think it's kind of cool, right? Okay. No, you guys are not buying that, but really, you look. A female cardinal thinks a red cardinal is beautiful.
Yes.
We look at a red cardinal and we say it's beautiful.
Yes.
Now, is that anthropomorphizing? No, I'm just telling you what I experience. I experience beauty. So does the female cardinal. Well, where did our genes partly come from? We all, you think when you go out on that branch that the DNA just changes radically. It doesn't. It's small percentage of changes. We still share a lot of genes back to a lot of DNA. Anyway, we don't have to go that far. I do want to, I'm not doing that just to go off on a tangent though. I want you, I guess what I'm trying to sort of get you to sort of envision is a little bit about how Teilhard thought about evolution. Like, it wasn't that consciousness was sort of an add-on. Like, we think, oh, we don't think that. Yes, we do. We think our minds and our bodies are different. Like, we act like that all the time. Like, as if our thoughts are something different than our bodies. And they are, right? I mean, if I think of a hamburger, it doesn't make me full. So, I mean, we have real experience that thoughts and body are different. But he wanted us to see that our thoughts actually, like, are part of this evolutionary process. Now, let's move on, because we have to move on. Yes? Somebody.
Isn't it also similar to that concept that emotions and actions by humans, for example, can change the structure of water, can change other non-biotic elements in the earth, and that also demonstrates that connection with what we're putting into the atmosphere energetically to those things.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's a great example. I don't know those studies, but that's how I would like to know them, because I could use them probably in some other thing. But so say it again so everybody can hear what you're saying.
Well, just several years ago, there was, I don't know if it was a movie or a book or a theory that you could look under a microscope or even maybe in some cases with the human eye, you could see how the structure of water would change depending on whether there was anger surrounding it,
that's interesting.
or love, or just different emotions and maybe other different forms of consciousness that you could track how those elements.
The physical elements were actually somehow this theory or this experiment or whatever was actually trying to demonstrate that the physical structure of matter would actually change based upon the affectivity in the environment. That's interesting. I don't know that, but that would be, I think that would be something that Teilhard would be like, see, told you. But so on that affectivity thing, and now getting onto this, within the noosphere, it's not just our thinking. Like, this is kind of a cool thing I think about Teilhard, because you could think of the noosphere as like about science and the like all the technology that we've made and all the all our art even. But he also sees the affectivity of that noosphere as essential to why it evolved. Affectivity meaning love, ultimately, as the highest form of affectivity. So he will, when he like traces in this book, he will trace the history of humans a little bit. He'll talk about like the finding of this fossil and that fossil, and he'll say what you also see in evolution is this movement towards socialization. This movement towards socialization. And he'll say even in these early socialization forms, the consciousness flowers. He calls it flowers. And he said, you could look at these paintings and you could say, did they not experience joy? These are Neanderthal paintings. I think Neanderthal. It's one of the French caves. So it's early human things. Did they not experience awe? Did they not experience... So these are all parts of the noosphere. These emotions and the socialization being a kind of material form of love. This was found in this thing. So there's this theory that this is a shaman in these cave paintings. We have a little bit of time, so not a little bit of time, but there's a couple other things I want to get to. So I just want you to sort of see this idea of this idea of the noosphere is not just science, right? It's art, and ultimately it's the affectiveness of love. So what happens in the noosphere? If you think of it as an age, not just a static thing, but as what happens during the noosphere? We're going to celebrate it in 6 days?
Oh, transformation?
Christ is born. Christ is born within the history of the noosphere. that is a major event. I mean, okay, so I know, okay, we're Christians, blah, 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 and Teilhard was a little, he definitely saw Christianity as sort of the pinnacle, and he was a Jesuit priest. But it is, I mean, it is a phenomenon. It happened. Like, Christianity was born. Jesus Christ was born. You know, this movement occurred. He sees that as he says, how can you not say that's a major event? We say it's a major event in history. But isn't history part of evolution? That's what his argument is. So he sees it as a major part of evolution. And what does it do? It opens a new branch in human evolution. Now then you say, well, wait a minute. Does that mean that Christ is different than us? Didn't we go all the way back to Chalcedon and say, can't do that? But he would say, and this goes, and I think I told you about, remember Maximus the Confessor, that nature can still have two movements. One towards greater complexity and one towards entropy and diffusion. And still you could do this. And you could say the greater complexity is upward and there's a dragging force of matter too. Sounds like a little bit like Augustine, but right? And so Christ reorients matter towards this goal of goodness, of love. Okay, so in and this is how the ancients would think of it too. It's not that human nature is changed. It's that human nature can be corrupted. Remember, we look for love in all the long praises. They still maintain that idea. We're not perfect. Remember Maximus says, my fullness can make up for your nothingness, and your nothingness can make up for my fullness. Or I think he used the term chaos. Remember, we all have a little chaos in us. And your order can help my chaos, and my order can help your chaos. That was Maximus the Confessor back in the 400s. So we're not finished. Evolution is not finished. But Christ was the example of human nature to its fullest potential. Now, I don't want to get too married to those words because it sounds like the human potential movement or something. Like it's all about living your best life or something like that. And that's not what Teilhard would say. And in the last 5 minutes, what we'll do is talk a little bit about his spirituality. Because he did not see this as becoming more and more like, more and more my, best individuality necessarily. I mean, okay, so I'm like, I don't want to, I'm going to confuse it because he does think that partly, but you know what I mean when I say the human potential movement, like, I'm, like trying to, it's not all about just fulfilling human potential in the way that we sort of think about it sometimes nowadays. Like, what's going to make us the most happy? What's going to give us the most pleasure? Because ultimately, my purpose, this is the reason, my purpose is to love others. So that my fulfillment is in how I interact with you guys. It's not just about me. It is partly about me, because if I don't have my stuff together, then I'm not going to love very well.
So he said that evolution was not random; it had a purpose to get to.
Yeah, he didn't argue with the mechanism of evolution. He didn't think like God was down there like kind of like tweaking things and making it go in a different direction or something like that. He just thought that the randomness did not imply meaninglessness.
That it had a purpose.
That it had a purpose. But that God chose to use the mechanism of evolution to get to his purpose. And he has a reasoning behind that. And then we're going to try to get to that in the last 5 minutes. How did I get all the way to only 5 minutes left? I don't know. I'm sorry. Yes, I told you about fire being sort of the image of the divine, and love was the flame that was transforming the universe. So I'm going to try to move us away from some of this heady stuff into a little bit more of his spirituality in the last 5 minutes. See, I told you about this. A new phylum was introduced into the evolutionary process. Now, could you accuse Teilhard of being a little too optimistic? I mean, yes, you could. He says in one of his books called The Grand Option, we got choice. We can choose to interpret all this as random, meaningless nothing. And we could go in that direction and we could live our lives with that. Now, no, and I think he's smart to say this. Like, don't think that's not a philosophy or a theology, because it is. It's just an anti-theology, an anti-philosophy. It's, it's still part of our consciousness. It's still a creation of, there is no empirical evidence of meaninglessness. There's none. You cannot show me something that will prove meaninglessness. But there's also no empirical evidence of meaning. Like, you can't show me something that definitively proves that meaning is embedded in. There's a bit of choice in there. So if you decide to go down the realm of meaninglessness, I mean, you might be. I'm not saying that you can't be convinced that there's meaning, and you can't be convinced that there's meaninglessness. Like, there are arguments to be made on both sides, but it's not. Ultimately, he thinks, Teilhard would say, doesn't it seem to point in aren't you convinced by my arguments? That's what he would want to say. Can't you see what I see now? Here's where we get in. But here's the thing about Teilhard. He was a mystic. Okay, he was a Jesuit mystic. And he felt this. He said, I had this experience I had these two experiences. One was that the universe was converging on Christ, and the other one was that I was becoming more like Christ. So one was this internal sense that Christ was being born within me, and the other one was this external sense that the whole universe was becoming Christ. So now Christ has three natures: divine, human, and cosmic. So this is like one of his, you guys will read this a little bit, one of his sort of statements. Oh, there's plenty of them. I'm going to try to see if I can find another one. Okay. Yes, okay, so let me, for the last couple of minutes, just give you a little sense of his spirituality a little bit, and this is from the Divine Milieu. So, you remember I have talked to you before about St. Ignatius of Loyola and how the Jesuits discern spirits, and this idea that you could have consolations and you can have desolations, right? So when you're trying to make a decision, you can look inwardly and be like, is this something that is kind of giving me peace? Is it giving me joy? Is it giving me a sense of fullness? Or is it drag me down? Is it making me feel dry and making me feel? Is it? And then sort of make your decision based upon an inner reflection of how these things make you feel. Now, Larry said to me last week, well, how do I know that's just not me making stuff up? And actually, Ignatius would say, it's not that every desolation has a meaning. The meaning might not be you shouldn't do this. The meaning might be, you need to do this, but you need to think about it differently or something like that. You need to do a little other work before you actually do it, but you still need to do it. So in other words, it wasn't so simple as every desolation means don't do it and every consolation means do it. That's all I want to get at. So Teilhard had this idea that our experiences, the world, the matter that impacted us either brought us down or brought us up. And he does use those words, so it starts to begin a little bit like Augustine in the body down here and spirit up here. But he really does, he talks about this idea that the loss of life, tragedies, the loss of loved ones, those things. He didn't see that as, he saw that as points along our path. And he saw them similar to the way you might compare a flowering tree to an arrangement of flowers that you picked and put in a jar. The flowering tree has weathered storms. It has weathered birds picking the fruits off of it. It has weathered other trees slamming into it. And so he says, isn't there something a little different about the beauty of the tree that has survived versus the way that we artificially put flowers in the vase. Quickly, I don't know if I've used this example before, but remember in the 70s when they made that dome in the desert of Arizona, and they were trying to like create this artificial. What happened to the plants in that thing? Yeah, why? There was no weather. There was no bad weather. Yeah, there was nothing to make them strong again. So I don't mean for you now to go out to your friend who's having a hard time and say, "This is making you stronger." That's not the message of this. But he would say he thought that those kind of things were forming us, were molding us more into Christ. And he did think that the church was a major way that we understood how to become more like Christ. Like this interaction is part of matter, and it's part of the movement of the Spirit towards his omega point ultimately, which is in Christ. Okay, done. Sorry, that sounds abrupt, but that's so. I'll leave you with this one thing. This is his Mass in the World, which kind of talks about what I talked about, the transubstantiation of matter. Here's my peacock. See, the two sides of matter: that which decays is a source of pain, it grows old, it gets sick. It is a source of physical exuberance, beauty, virile effort, growth, joy. By matter we are nourished, lifted up, linked to everything else, and invaded by life. That's a quote from him. So I'm going to leave you with this poem. And the reason I chose this poem at the end is because I think that its message is one of a spiritual value, kindness, but also the fact that kindness can be born of pain. So does anybody want to read it? Can see it and read it? Nobody? Nobody? Me? I'll read it.
Thank you.
I can't see.
I'll read it. You want me to read it?
I can read it.
You want to read it? Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. I'll use this mic.
Before you know what kindness really is, you must lose things. Feel the future dissolve in a moment, like salt in a weakened broth. What you held in your hand, what you counted and carefully saved, all this must go, so you know how desolate the landscape can be. Between the regions of kindness, how you ride and ride thinking the bus will never stop. The passengers eating maize and chicken will stare out the window forever. Before you learn the tender gravity of kindness, you must travel where the Indian in a white poncho lies dead by the side of the road. You must see how this could be you, how he too was someone who journeyed through the night with plans and the simple breath that kept him alive. Before you know kindness as the deepest thing inside, you must know sorrow as the other deepest thing. You must wake up with sorrow. You must speak to it till your voice catches the thread of all sorrows, and you see the size of the cloth. Then it is only kindness that makes sense anymore. Only kindness that ties your shoes and sends you out into the day to gaze at bread. Only kindness that raises its head from the crowd of the world to say, "It is I you have been looking for," and then goes with you everywhere, like a shadow or a friend.
All right. That's it.
Thank you.
Thank you.